Hello and welcome to lecture number 48, topic 3.13, Envisioning Africa in Harlem Renaissance Poetry. There's only one learning objective today, and that is to explain how Harlem Renaissance poets express their relationship to Africa in their poetry. Within the Harlem Renaissance, writers were divided on the purpose of black literature. Writers like Alain Locke, W.E.B. Du Bois, Jessie Fauset, and Benjamin Brawley believed that literature should be used to promote a positive image of African Americans. They felt literature could serve as a tool to uplift the race and counteract negative stereotypes that had been perpetuated by society for centuries. Du Bois, for instance, saw art as a weapon in the fight for civil rights and social justice, believing it should reflect the nobility and achievement of African Americans. However, writers like Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston opposed this approach. They believed that the writing should not be constrained by a need for approval from either white or black audiences. They prioritized authenticity over respectability, aiming to depict the full range of black life with all its complexities. Langston Hughes famously stated that he didn't care if white audiences liked his writing, and similarly, he was not concerned if black audiences approved of his work. His focus was on creating literature that authentically expressed the realities of African American life, without the burden of conforming to societal expectations. Claude McKay echoed this sentiment, using his poetry to confront issues of race and class, even when it challenged mainstream sensibilities. Connections to the writer's African heritage were evident in much of the writing and art from this era. This can be seen across various media. Aaron Douglas, for example, incorporated African elements into his artwork. His painting often portrayed African figures in traditional dress, interacting with symbols of African culture, which served as a reminder of the rich history and civilization that existed before the transatlantic slave trade. His work celebrated African identity and reasserted a sense of pride in African roots. An example of one of his paintings is seen here on the screen. Zora Neale Hurston, who was a trained anthropologist, documented African American folklore in her book Mules and Men. She traveled across Florida and New Orleans, recording folk tales and oral histories that revealed the African roots of many African American traditions. Her work emphasized the continuity of African cultural practices in the New World, particularly in the way she showcased African spirituality, music, and storytelling in her fieldwork. Leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey also promoted Pan-Africanism, advocating for a sense of solidarity among black people worldwide. They argued that the civil rights struggle in the U.S. was part of a larger global fight against white supremacy and colonialism. Garvey, through his Universal Negro Improvement Association, pushed for African Americans to embrace their African heritage and even called for a return to Africa to build an independent black nation. Du Bois, although more focused on civil rights within the U.S., also emphasized the shared heritage and struggle of all people of African descent. Both believed in the importance of uniting black people across the diaspora, linking their struggles in the U.S., the Caribbean, and Africa. Despite these connections to African heritage, some writers and artists expressed a sense of detachment from Africa in their work. This detachment often stemmed from the legacy of European colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, which had severed African Americans from their ancestral homelands for generations. For many, Africa had become a distant and abstract concept, something they were culturally disconnected from. These writers were more likely to focus on affirming their identities as African Americans, rooted in the present and their experiences in the United States, rather than romanticizing or dwelling on their ancestral history. This tension between embracing African roots and asserting a new identity as African Americans is a recurring theme in the Harlem Renaissance literature. For example, the New Negro movement that the Harlem Renaissance was a part of was led by figures like Alain Locke, who aimed to define black identity in a distinctly American context, while still acknowledging its African origins. This division in focus reflects the broader complexities of African American identity during the Harlem Renaissance, caught between a painful history, a complex present, and an aspirational future. Today, we're going to explore the phenomenon by looking at two different poems from the 1920s, both titled Heritage, one by Gwendolyn Bennett and the other by County Cullen. Let's begin with Gwendolyn Bennett's Heritage, written in 1922. In this poem, Bennett uses rich imagery to counter negative stereotypes about Africa's people and landscapes. I'll read the poem for you since it's very short. I want to see the slim palm trees pulling at the clouds with little pointed fingers. I want to see lithe Negro girls etched back against the sky while sunset lingers. I want to hear the silent sands singing to the moon before the Sphinx still face. I want to hear the chanting around a heathen fire of a strange black race. I want to breathe the lotus flower sighing to the stars while tendrils drinking at the Nile. I want to feel the surging of my sad people's soul, hidden by a minstrel smile. What Bennett does here is portray Africa in a grand and majestic way, countering the perception that Africa is a dark continent devoid of history or culture, stereotypes promoted by European colonialism and the legacy of slavery. By depicting the lands as full of natural splendor and a historical significance, she creates a sense of pride for those with African roots. Bennett references historical empires like Egypt when she mentions the Nile River and the Sphinx, drawing attention to Africa's ancient civilizations. The natural imagery, palm trees, sands, lotus flowers, paints a picture of Africa as a place of beauty and abundance. The repetition of I want throughout the poem conveys a strong sense of longing. In the final stanza, Bennett reveals the ultimate purpose of her poem when she writes, I want to feel the surging of my sad people's soul, hidden by a minstrel smile. Here she expresses a desire to uplift and elevate African people whose true identity and dignity have been obscured by negative stereotypes of minstrel shows and other racist depictions. Now let's turn to County Cullen's heritage. This poem, written in 1925, provides a different perspective than Bennett's. This poem reflects an internal conflict over Cullen's relationship to Africa. While Bennett celebrates her connection to Africa, Cullen grapples with a sense of distance from his cultural roots. The poem is too long to present in full here, but I've included some of the key excerpts, beginning with the first stanza. What is Africa to me? Copper sun or scarlet sea, jungle star or jungle track, strong bronze men or regal black women from whose loins I sprang when the birds of Eden sang, 3 centuries removed from the scenes his father loved, spicy grove, cinnamon tree, what is Africa to me? Cullen opens with the phrase, what is Africa to me? But it's not formed as a question needing an answer. Instead, the Cullen suggests that Cullen has reflected on this deeply. His descriptions of Africa, its copper sun, scarlet sea, strong bronze men, evoke power and grandeur, yet there's also a sense of distance and detachment. He acknowledges that he is 3 centuries removed from the land of his ancestors once knew and loved. Not only is he removed by time, but he also is physically removed from Africa. He draws a distinction between what Africa is like and also where he currently resides. In this stanza, he says, here no leprous flowers rear, fierce corollas in the air, here no body sleek and wet, dripping mingled rain and sweat, tread the savage measures of jungle boys and girls in love. Not only is he drawing the distinctions between Africa and where he is at, but he also creates a sense of foreignness when he's describing Africa. Not necessarily in a bad way, but is definitely different than where he's currently living. Another distinction that Cullen creates is that of religion. In one section, he writes, my conversion came high-priced. I belong to Jesus Christ, preacher of humility. Heathen gods are naught to me. Here, Cullen distances himself from African spiritual traditions, emphasizing that his conversion to Christianity has separated him from the heathen gods of Africa. This struggle between cultural roots and religious identity underscores his sense of alienation from Africa, despite the unremitting beat of Africa in his consciousness as he describes it later in the poem. Cullen admits the persistent pull of Africa despite his attempts to distance himself from it. He writes, so I lie who find no peace, night or day, nor slight release from the unremittent beat made by cruel padded feet walking through my body's street. Though he tries to focus on his American identity, the pull of Africa remains strong, creating a sense of inner conflict. And finally, for the recap, Harlem Renaissance writers, artists, and scholars explored their connections to Africa in diverse ways. Some, like Gwendolyn Bennett, used rich imagery to counter negative stereotypes of Africa and foster pride in African heritage. Others, like County Cullen, explored their personal reflections on Africa, often grappling with feelings of distance and detachment from their ancestral roots. These poets contributed to a broader dialogue within the Harlem Renaissance about the meaning of African heritage in the lives of African Americans. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.